Hey guys, welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're going to talk about pawns and how pawns move. Now, one thing I'll say about pawns is that if you can understand pawns and how to use pawns, this is going to be a huge element in your overall chess game play. I have to say that that is probably an area of weakness that I have and I need to continue to improve upon. But pawn play is a very specific skill set that when you understand them, you understand their power and their structure and how they lend to the other pieces in terms of where to place your rooks, your knights, your bishops. Pawns can be very formidable in all phases of the game: the opening, the middle game, and the end game. So we're going to talk about how the pawns move in this particular video. And as you can see from the screen, pawns start off on this first, or it's not the first rank, but it is the second rank. And both black and white will have a rank like this. And on the very first move of the game, and not very first move of the game, but your very first time you move a pawn, any pawn, the pawn can move either one square or two squares. One square or two squares. So what do I mean? So let's put this pawn back and this pawn back. So if it's my turn to move, I'm starting the game as white. I can decide to move this pawn just one square. Or if it's to my liking to move this pawn further, I keep calling it a square, I can move it two squares. So that's true for every single pawn along this row. Same for this pawn. This pawn can move either one square or it can move two squares. So there are specific reasons that we'll get into later why you want to move these two pawns to the center as soon as possible in most cases when you're starting a game of chess. And there are some very specific reasons why you don't want to do the same with these two pawns in the very opening moves of the game. Okay? But in reality, all of these pawns share the same characteristics for white and for black. So in the starting position of the game, this is what the pawns all look like. You've got your rooks, right, on either side. You've got your knights on either side. You've got your bishops on either side. And of course, you have your queen. And then you have the all-important king right next to the queen. And then in front of all of the pieces, you have your pawns. So these are the generals and the corporals and the warriors, and the pawns. Think of these as the grunts. These are the ground troops. These are the ones that are probably going to engage the enemy first. So let's clear the board again, and we'll add our pawns here. All right. So one of the reasons that we think of moving these two pawns first in the beginning of the game is if you can get these two pawns here on these two squares, these pawns control a lot of what's going on in the center of the board. And the reason that this is important is because pawns, when they capture other pieces, capture on a diagonal to their opposite color. So even though a pawn can only move one or two squares, like it can move one square, or in the very first move, it can move two squares. But then after that, if it's my turn, I can only move one square. My opponent takes a turn, then it's my turn, I can move another square, and so forth. They take their turn, now it's my turn, I can move another square. So pawns move very slow, except for that very first opening move. We can move two squares forward. Okay, I keep getting tongue-tied here. Okay, but a pawn has the ability to capture more like a bishop. It can capture diagonally. So that means if the enemy had a pawn here, this pawn cannot capture this. This pawn cannot move in here and capture it. That would be illegal. That cannot happen. All right. This pawn can only capture diagonally. And same thing with black. It can only capture diagonally. So that means these two pawns basically are blocked. They're blockading each other. However, if this pawn goes to this square, see, diagonally, the dark square pawn can capture on this square. So if this pawn goes to this square, this pawn can now capture it. Okay, and then it becomes a whole different pawn. And now it moves to the way it normally moved. Now this pawn, see, it's a light square and it's looking at the diagonal, can capture back. And now that's its first move, and it only moved one square diagonally. Every move after this, this pawn can only move one square per turn. One square per turn. Same thing with this one square per turn. But if I need to get this pawn into the action, it's my turn to move, and it's the first time I'm moving this pawn, I can move this pawn 2 moves, 2 squares. Okay? All right, so what else can I say about pawns? I think that's pretty much it about pawns. I mentioned that pawns can move 1 square on the first move that you move them, or they can move 2 squares on the first move that you move them. One reason that you'd want to consider moving them 2 squares is because 2 squares gives you more control in the center of the board. Now our opponent makes a move, and now we move our second pawn into the center. So if we can get 2 squares here in the center of the board, we're controlling a lot of squares. Now, no matter what black does, if black has a knight sitting here, black has to be very careful because now I have a pawn that can move forward and attack. See, there's the diagonal. There's the diagonal. So pawns are very effective, particularly when they're working together against, anything. If this was a queen, here, and let's say this pawn was here, this pawn, because it's supported by its brother pawn, can actually attack the powerful queen. That queen would have no choice but to move out of the way, or go to a different color square or step in front of it somehow. But so the pawn is very, 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 very flexible in that regard. But mostly what I would say about the pawn is that it really needs to have the support of its brothers. So whenever possible, we want to keep our pawns somehow in a family, connected somehow. That's not going to always be the case. There are going to be times when we're going to have a pawn that is all by itself. It's going to be all isolated. I guess that's the word you would use. And it's going to be subjected to attacks from the enemy. So whenever possible, if we can keep even just one member of the family together with the brother, with his sister pawn, this queen can no longer go to this square. It can't attack this pawn because this pawn now on the diagonal can attack back. So let's look at the starting position again. From the very beginning of the game, pawns can either move 2 squares forward or they can move 1 square forward. Whether they move 1 square or 2 squares, they can capture on diagonals. Ideally, we want to get 2 pawns into the center of the board, giving us more control in the center. That's it, folks. There you have your pawns. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, like and subscribe, and I will see you in our next video. Take care.